it is officially Targaryen December. A month some will love and others will hate. So to begin this most glorious of months, I thought we should start by talking about where the Targaryens began. Because before Aegon the Conqueror decided he wanted Westeros for his own, House Targaryen was a lesser house with limited power and respect from Valyria. So this video, let's talk about what the Targaryens were like before their conquests, their history, and how they got to Dragonstone, and the Targaryens that led up to the conquest. So to understand the origins of the Targaryens, we first have to talk about Valyria, a now ruined city in Essos. Valyria, or Old Valyria, was located on a peninsula bearing the same name that extends into the Summer Sea. According to the best sources, ancient Valyria was inhabited by a civilization of humble shepherds. Well, humble shepherds commonly with purple eyes and silver gold to platinum hair that were considered strikingly, if not inhumanly, beautiful. So humble, but very distinct from other people of this world. These shepherds would forever change their destiny when they discovered dragons in the 14 Flames, a ring of volcanoes on their peninsula. According to those in Ashai, they managed to tame these dragons through the use of magic taught to them by a vanished people. This taming of dragons soon led to the Valyrians being able to raise and train dragons, not only for their own pleasure, but as monstrous and devastating weapons of war, sometimes those two being the same thing. Dragons obviously were a huge game changer, and as they expanded their territory and influence, the Freehold became their capital city. Magic, dragons, and topless towers rose here, and as they grew in power, their thirst for more control and more resources grew, causing them to begin to reach out and conquer. On Valyria, 40 ancient noble houses known as Dragon Riders, houses with the greatest wealth, influence, sorceress ability, and dragons, would come to rule the Valyrian Freehold. The Targaryens were one of those 40 families, but not nearly as powerful and certainly not the most respected. In fact, around 126 BC, before Aegon's conquest, the 40 houses were in endless competition for power and glory in court and council. This need for power resulted in what the maesters report as an endless, subtle, off-savage struggle for dominance. Though all freeholders and freeborn landowners had a say in the governance of the freehold, in reality these 40 houses had the most power. Again, while the Targaryens were part of this 40 families, they were nowhere near the top. Despite being a lesser house of the 40, the Targaryens would soon get a leg up, by being the only Dragon Rider house that didn't die in a horrible and painful way. A mass wipe of your enemies generally means you get to move up in the world. Or so I'm told. So legend goes that in 126 BC, Aenar Targaryen's maiden daughter Daenys had a prophetic vision. She saw the destruction of Valyria by fire and all who called it home. Her father believed in her vision and acted on it. Selling his holdings in the Freehold and the lands of the Long Summer, Aenar moved all his wives, slaves, wealth, dragons, siblings, kin, and children to Dragonstone. And the island of Dragonstone has a special history. It had been settled 2 centuries before by Valyrians who had defeated local lords in the Narrow Sea. After taking Dragonstone, those Valyrians used magic to shape the castle of Dragonstone. However, at the time of Aenar fleeing, it was still a bleak island citadel that sat beneath a smoking mountain in the Narrow Sea. So perhaps not good enough even for a lesser Dragon Rider house. Because of Daenys' vision, she would forever be called Daenys the Dreamer, and the ability to have these dreams or visions would be carried on through the Targaryen bloodline. Now, if you had a rival and they straight up left the greatest city in the known world and the center of civilization to go to some dreary island, you would think it's a victory, right? Obviously the Targaryens left because they were cowards, and they were surrendering to the greater Dragon Rider families of Valyria. In fact, the rumor was that Aenar Targaryen lost a power struggle with some Dragon Rider families and fled to Valyria. Or worse, he committed a crime he then ran from. But regardless of being called cowards and whatever rumors were said about the Targaryens, 12 years later, all those that slung insults or those rumors would be super dead. No revenge is sweeter than everyone that ever slung an insult at you dying horribly. And I don't want to embellish, but I'm pretty certain the Targaryens popped some bubbly when they heard all their rivals were fucking dead. Though at the same time, probably devastated that their homeland was destroyed. So just as Daenys saw, the Doom of Valyria came to pass in 114 BC. There are many ideas on what exactly caused the Doom to happen. Perhaps it was a natural and catastrophic explosion that caused all 14 flames to erupt together. Or maybe the true gods wanted to smite the Valyrians who believed in more than 100 gods, who in their greed and godlessness went too deep and unleashed the fires of the seven hells. Or maybe the constant power struggle between the families and the murder and sabotage that went with it made the magic that allegedly controlled the 14 flames unstable and led to the event. There are a lot of theories, including the Targaryens may have had a hand in it, and maybe even the Faceless Men. But it doesn't matter why, because the result was utter destruction. Within hours, the freehold was shattered and destroyed. Every hill for 500 miles was split open, filling the air with smoke, fire, and ash so hot even the dragons in the sky couldn't survive. Instead, they were engulfed and consumed. Holes opened in the earth, and temples, palaces, and entire towns disappeared in them. To the north, parts of the peninsula fell into the sea. Lakes boiled and then turned to acid, and lava spewed 1,000 feet in the air. In a day, the great Valyrian Empire and the Dragon Rider families, minus the Targaryens, were all gone. Well, obviously not every single dragon rider was on Valyria when the Doom happened, so some dragon riders besides the Targaryens did survive, but they actually died shortly after due to a variety of circumstances. So yeah, the Targaryens were really the only surviving dragon rider family. But even if the Valyrian freehold hadn't been destroyed, the Targaryens were already pretty set on Dragonstone. Being across the gullet, it gave the Targaryens a stranglehold on Blackwater Bay, where a lot of trade took place. This strategic location allowed the Targaryens to fill their pockets off of this passing trade. Not just them, but their closest allies, the Velaryons of Driftmark, a lesser house of Valyrian descent. While the Targaryens ruled the skies with their dragons, the Velaryons ruled the middle reaches of the Narrow Sea with their ships. However, the Velaryons were aided by another Valyrian house, the Celtigars of Claw Isle, that allied themselves with the family. It wasn't all rainbows and sunshine, though. In the century that followed the Doom, the Targaryens lost 4 of the 5 dragons they had brought to Dragonstone, with only Balerion the Black Dread remaining. And even though they were mostly done with the East, they couldn't help but keep their eyes looking over there, probably feeling a pang of loss. But time marches on, and when Aenar Targaryen died, the title of Lord of Dragonstone passed to his son, Gaemon Targaryen, who had married his sister Daenys. Gaemon became known as the Glorious for full reasons we aren't given, and I want, but George is a tease as we all know, and we probably won't ever know. As they wanted to keep the bloodline pure, the Targaryens would continue to marry siblings to each other. Gaemon's son Aegon and his daughter Alanna married, and would then rule after Gaemon's death. When they died, the lordship of Dragonstone went to their son Maeggon and his brothers Aerys and Aerys' sons, Aelic, Balon, and Damian. The last of them was Damian Targaryen, whose son Aerion then became Lord of Dragonstone. Now, Aerion was the father of Aegon, who would later be known as Aegon the Conqueror. But first, Aerion and his wife, Valanna Velaryon, who was half Targaryen on her mother's side, welcomed a girl into the world named Visenya in 29-ish BC. After Visenya came Aegon in 27 BC. He would be the firstborn and only son of Aerion. A girl Rhaenys followed a few years later. These 3 siblings would eventually do what all good Targaryens did. They'd fuck each other. Aegon was expected to marry Visenya, as was custom to wed brother and sister to keep the bloodline as pure as possible, and tradition dictated he would wed his older sister. However, Aegon, the total badass he was, decided he wanted 2 wives and married both his sisters. Now, it probably wasn't because he was a total horn dog. He had to marry Visenya out of duty, but he really wanted to bang Rhaenys. so marrying them both essentially got him a cake he could also eat. So, good on you, Aegon. Now, you may remember me saying that when the Targaryens went to Dragonstone, they brought 5 dragons with them, and only one of those 5 survived in the century that followed the Doom. This became a problem because all 3 siblings were dragon riders, and after Aegon claimed Balerion the Black Dread as his dragon, that kind of left his sisters with having to pick a different one. They were in luck though, because 2 dragons, Vhagar and Meraxes, were actually hatched on Dragonstone after the Targaryens had fled Valyria. This meant all 3 siblings could have their own dragon, which they actually used to explore Westeros before the Conquest, but I'll get back to that because Aegon hadn't turned his eyes completely to the west yet. With the Valyrian freehold's destruction, a power vacuum in the east had occurred, which led to what was called the Century of Blood. During the latter half of this, Volantis decided they were the rightful heirs to the remains of the Valyrian freehold, and they started to attack and expand their power. The other free cities, happy to be governed by themselves, did not want any of this. To stop Volantis, Pentos and Tyrosh reached out to Aegon. Aegon answered their call and flew on his dragon to meet with the Prince of Pentos and their magisters. Aegon then decided to help the free cities by flying his dragon to Lys and burning the Volantis fleet that was attempting to invade the city. After providing help, and with Volantis finally simmering down, Aegon returned to Dragonstone. This is when his focus truly turned to the west. But don't be deceived into thinking this is the first time that Aegon and his sister wives showed any interest in Westeros. In fact, there seems to be proof that the siblings had stepped foot on Westeros long before the Conquest ever began. Some proof is with the painted table. A large table more than 50 feet long and 25 feet at its widest and 4 feet at its narrowest. This table was carved and painted in the form of a detailed map of Westeros. This table, painted to show all the woods, rivers, towns, and castles in the 7 kingdoms, was commanded by Aegon to be built years before he landed to take the 7 kingdoms. But just not that. There's proof that Aegon and his sister Visenya visited the citadel of Oldtown in their youth and went honking on the arbor as guests of Lord Redwine. If the tales are true, Aegon may have even went to Lannisport for a visit. So when did Aegon decide he wanted the 7 kingdoms for himself? Well, we know the event that predated the Conquest, that was likely the final shove. As I covered in my Regions videos, the 7 kingdoms were a mess with constant fighting. War was commonplace amongst the 7 kingdoms. Maesters considered 2 areas to be the most aggressive when Aegon was in his mid-20s though: Harren the Black and Argilac the Arrogant. While the nitty-gritty details of these 2 aren't that important, let's just say the 2 kings were in a constant contest for power and land grabbing. Being old, Argilac feared that since Harrenhal was almost finished, Harren would come for him and his land. This caused Argilac to reach out to the Targaryens, offering his only child, a maiden daughter, to Aegon as a wife, which would include all the lands east of the God's Eye from the Trident to the Blackwater Rush as her dowry. Aegon wasn't a dummy though. First, he already had 2 super hot wives that had dragons. Second, the lands being offered weren't Argilac's to give, but belonged to Harrenhal and therefore Harren. Aegon knew that the aging Storm King simply wanted a buffer between him and the savage Harren. But Aegon didn't just turn down the proposal. He gave a counter offer to the Storm King that just set that guy off. Aegon offered that he would take the lands if Argilac gave Massey's Hook and the woods and plains from the Blackwater south to the River Wendwater and the headwaters of the Mander to the Targaryens. To bind his deal, he offered Orys Baratheon, Aegon's childhood friend and champion and bastard half-brother, in a marriage to Argilac's daughter. Dude didn't handle rejection well. Argilac considered a base-born bastard marrying his daughter to be a great insult. So as any sane person would do, he cut off the hands of the envoy and sent it back to Aegon with a letter that said, "These are the only hands your bastard shall have of me." Maybe a little bit over the top, Argilac. Aegon made no reply to Argilac, but was probably not enthused, and Argilac's douchery was likely the final shove that made Aegon go, "You wanna know what? Fine. I'm just gonna take all your shit." Indeed, after receiving the severed hands and message, Aegon summoned his bannermen, friends, and allies to convene on Dragonstone. The Valyrians of Driftmark and Celtigars of Claw Isle, both sworn to House Targaryen, answered the summons. Surprisingly, so did some of those sworn to Storm's End. From Massey's Hook, Lord Bar Emmon of Sharppoint and Lord Massey of Stonedance had closer ties to Dragonstone and decided to come. Aegon and his sisters held council and listened to what they all had to say. The 3 Targaryens also went to the Castle Sept to pray to the Seven of Westeros, even though Aegon wasn't considered a religious man and the Seven weren't his religion. Well, yet. On the 7th day, ravens flew from the towers of Dragonstone to bring Aegon's decree to the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. The ravens flew to all 7 kings, to the Citadel, to small and great lords, all saying the same thing. From this day forth, there would be but one king in Westeros. Those who bent the knee to Aegon of House Targaryen would keep their lands and titles. Those who took up arms against him would be thrown down, humbled, and destroyed. From there, a modest Targaryen host, some say 3,000, others say that Aegon only had a handful, maybe even hundreds, sailed for the 7 kingdoms and landed on the mouth of the Blackwater Rush. The Targaryens were ready to start their conquests. So that's the Targaryens before the Conquest, a lesser dragon rider family from Valyria that rose to power thanks to a lucky vision, or perhaps cowardice and running away, and going to a strategic home. Oh, and dragons. Dragons definitely helped. Hey, thanks for watching, and big thanks to my patrons on Patreon who voted for a very merry Targaryen December. And here is the first code word. If you don't know what this code word is actually used for, just watch the trailer that's on my channel. Like, subscribe, and come back for more videos.